Hey there everyone, and happy International Translation Day. Before we start today's show, I just wanted to say a big thank you for listening. Today is our 50th episode. Whether you're a subscriber or a first-time listener, we wouldn't still be here if you weren't listening. So thank you very, very much. I have to say that this does feel like a major milestone. The podcast has been on the air for exactly 5 years. We released episode 1 on International Translation Day 2015. I don't think I really understood what I was getting myself into back then. I had no idea what I was doing, and honestly, I still don't. But here we are, and I'd like to think that we are adding value, giving people like me who love podcasts a chance to listen and learn about ATA, as well as the translation and interpreting professions. We've covered a lot these past 5 years. We've looked into how ATA works, explored the benefits of membership, parsed ATA's mini programs, previewed the annual conferences, shared the association's outreach and advocacy efforts, and so much more. If you don't know much about ATA, be sure to check out our past episodes. Thanks again, everyone. Now let's start the show. Welcome to the ATA podcast. I'm your host, Matt Baird, and you're listening to episode 50. Each month on the podcast, we bring you news and insights from the American Translators Association. In today's very special edition, we're celebrating International Translation Day by inviting past ATA President Nicholas Hartman to take us on a walk down memory lane. Nick, who has been a freelance translator and an ATA member since 1984, tells us the story of how he went from studying the classics to translating the latest innovations. We'll hear how his first ATA conference changed his life, and how he has spent the past 3.5 decades giving back to the association he calls home. Don't miss this unique look at 35 years of ATA and translation history. But first, a few quick announcements.
Hey translators and interpreters, happy International Translation Day! To celebrate this year, ATA is releasing a short video to remind the world just how critical translators and interpreters really are. It illustrates how the smartphone went from a simple idea to a device used by 3.5 billion people around the world, all with the help of translators and interpreters. You can find this fun and informative video on any of ATA's social media platforms, including YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Pinterest. Share it with your friends, followers, and contacts to give them an inside look into how our work directly impacts their daily lives. Also, if you're not an ATA member, listen up. There's never been a better time to join the American Translators Association. Right now, if you get an ATA membership for 2021, you'll get the rest of 2020 absolutely free. That's right, 15 months for the price of 12. Don't wait. The demand for translators and interpreters is growing, but finding quality jobs can be a big challenge. The market power of ATA membership can make a big difference. Learn more on ATA's website. Go to atanet.org/join. And finally, did you know that ATA offers a 50% discount on membership dues to uniformed members of the military, both active duty and reserves? The American Translators Association has found that translators and interpreters working in the defense language community are often unaware of the resources and benefits that come with ATA membership. We hope this discount will help introduce them to what ATA can do. If you know someone who qualifies, please tell them about this great opportunity. The discount is available to new members only. Look for the military discount option on ATA's membership application. You'll also find a link to the online form in the show notes. For more information on each of these announcements and more, look for the links in this episode's notes.
Joining me now is Nicholas Hartman. Nick earned BA and MA degrees in 1973 and his PhD in 1982. In 1984, he joined ATA and began working full-time as an independent technical and scientific translator. He now specializes in translating patents and related documents for industrial clients and law firms in the US and Europe. He is a past president of ATA, and he has also served the association as president-elect and conference organizer, a director, and secretary. He was also administrator of the Science and Technology Division, and over the years he chaired several ATA committees, such as client education, governance and communications, and science and technology information. Nick also co-chaired the Business Practices Education Committee, and he was a member of the Terminology Committee and the ATA Chronicle Editorial Board. He is also past president of the American Foundation for Translation and Interpretation. Nick holds ATA certification in French to English, German to English, and Italian to English. Nick, welcome so much to the podcast. It's really great to have you with us today.
Thank you, Matt. Pleasure to be here. I'm looking forward to this.
Well, the pleasure is actually all mine because to have you on the podcast and celebrate International Translation Day this year. And on top of that, today is our 50th show. So it's a very special episode to me, and it's a very special moment to be celebrating the International Translation Day. And you've been a freelance translator and an ATA member for over 35 years. And that means you've been a member for more than half of the association's existence. And I think it's safe to say you've been a very active member pretty much right from the get-go. And we're going to find out more of that as we talk. So that's why I wanted to have you on the show today. I want to take a look back at your involvement with ATA, your very long career, and get a sense of what it's been like to be a freelance translator these past 3.5 decades. So the ATA was founded in 1959, so it's 61 years ago. That was well before your time, but you became a member 25 years later, 1984. Let's start by having you share why you joined the association.
I joined the association because I had begun doing some very part-time translation work in my last few years of graduate school.
Okay.
At a time when I didn't really know that there was such a thing as a professional translator. But I started to do a little research in the yellow pages at that time and came across American Translators Association and sent away for the membership form, and it all seemed legitimate and above board, and sent them my money and became a member and found that there were some interesting things going on. So I basically joined in order to find other people who were doing what I was doing, which I wasn't really sure at the time what it was.
Okay. Well, then did joining have an impact on your business and your career right away?
Right. In terms of business, no, because it wasn't until about a year after I joined that I went full time as a freelancer.
Okay.
In terms of my perception of myself and my understanding of the profession and the career, it was an instant effect.
Okay.
I realized that there were other people doing what I was doing, that they were well organized and had interesting things that they were doing. There were publications, there were ways of communicating with people. And that instantly raised, I guess you'd call it, my professional self-esteem and my sense of belonging to something other than a bunch of people sitting around translating in their spare time. So yes, that was an immediate impact. The business impact came later.
Okay. It's interesting because, later my first experience with ATA was in 2000 when I attended the conference for the first time. And it was a very eye-opening experience because I had no idea that there was this industry out there. But, tell us a little more, what was ATA like back in the 1980s?
It was a pretty Mickey Mouse operation.
Okay.
I mean that in the best possible way. It was 25 years since its foundation, but many of the founding members are still very much active. So, in terms of physical presence, the ATA headquarters was 2 or 3 masonite paneled rooms above a very modest strip mall in Ossining, New York, up the Hudson from New York City. And my wife and I went and visited there, actually. And the ATA staff was a small, energetic lady named Rosemary Malia, who had an assistant and rooms and rooms and rooms full of paper. And that was it. That was ATA.
Wow, that's interesting.
It was in the process of being dragged into the 20th century by Patricia Newman, who
Uh-huh.
became president, I think in 86 or 87,
Okay.
and who introduced the concept of a computer and a database and of organization and all kinds of radical ideas like that. And that was just beginning, but ATA was a very, very small scale outfit in terms of its physical presence. And
Mm-hmm.
we were still very much influenced by the founders, who were almost all men,
Mm-hmm.
interestingly, for a profession that's now female
Yeah.
skewed. And many of them were what was then called bureau owners. They were translators themselves, very capable, but they
Mm-hmm.
decided they wanted to expand and they needed more capabilities than they themselves had. So it was
Mm-hmm. Oh.
very much very personal, very small scale, um, intimate, I guess you'd call it now,
Uh-huh. Okay.
but with the constant idea of making this a profession from the beginning was one of the goals of the founders.
So how did members interact back then? And you just said there wasn't, I believe, I sort of read, there wasn't a lot of opportunity to really get together, I guess, other than the annual conference, or maybe there was. So yeah, how did members interact?
Members interacted by publications. There was a
Hmm.
stuff called paper, and
What's that?
you would get newsletters. I think it was called the Chronicle by then, which came out on paper, I think every
Huh.
month, full of useful stuff. The Science and Technology Division, which I think we'll talk about later,
Hmm.
um, already existed, had its own publication, and that was circulated. So that was
Hmm.
one way of getting in touch with people. But the crown of all of it was the conference. That
Yes.
was the big
Okay.
deal.
Let's switch gears real quick. What was it like then to be a freelance translator at that time?
Well, it was much like it is now. You sit in a room in front of, at that time, not a screen, but a typewriter,
Hmm.
and you read what it is that you're supposed to translate it, and you write it down, and you go back and you check it and you edit it, and then sometimes you get on the bus and you take it downtown, or you put it in the mail. Or if you're really on the cutting edge, you put it through your fax machine.
Hmm.
And that's kind of it. The big difference is how you find information.
Hmm.
And I think we'll talk about that a little later, but basically the revolution, the huge change in how I do my work now compared with back then is reference resources.
Hmm.
And you can guess that this has a lot to do with Google and with Wikipedia,
Yeah.
and has a lot less to do with the rooms full of books that I used to have.
Yeah. So you obviously had a large, I'm sure, a large reference library at home. Did you have to take any trips to the library?
Um, when when we lived in one of the closer suburbs of Chicago,
Uh-huh.
I was working at home, and I stuffed my, the spare bedroom office of mine with as much reference material as it would hold. And I do remember having to get on the subway and go downtown to the main library
Uh-huh.
to find stuff, because that was where I knew I could find it, and that was the only way to find it. So yes, I had to go out and look for stuff when my own library didn't cover it.
Yeah. It's probably hard to imagine for most starting translators nowadays, and even for me as a working translator, with Google was already in existence when I started. I did have lots of physical reference materials in the beginning, and I've used them less and less and less and less over the years until now they're just collecting dust. Um, it's very, very interesting. Now, you mentioned the annual conference earlier, and that has been a real central feature. You said that was the one big event even back then in the early years, and so it really has been a central feature of the association from the very beginning. But I understand that in the early years, it was more like an annual meeting, and it was like one day. And I did a little, looked back at the history a little bit, and um, apparently there was some experimentation going on in the 60s and the 70s. Some volunteers really tried to get a more convention style event going on, and that happened a couple of times. But the transition to a more comprehensive program, the one we know today, didn't really take place until the early 1980s. So that was about the time you came on board. What was your first conference experience like in 1984? I believe that was correct.
Yes, 1984 was my first conference, and that was after that transition that you just talked about. And that, again, I believe was due to Patricia Newman,
Okay.
who said, if we're going to be a profession, we need to act like professionals. We're not a trade association. We don't have a convention. We have a conference.
Yeah.
We share knowledge the way knowledge workers do. And the first conference was in 1984. I was living in Philadelphia. The conference was in New York, so it was an easy trip. My parents were living still in New York, so I had someplace to stay, and it was in a hotel whose name I'm sure has changed, right across from the back entrance to Penn Station in Midtown Manhattan. And I hope we got it cheap because it was under construction at the time. So there was a lot of plywood and work lights and all that sort of stuff. But I had been a member for a while. I had joined the Sci-Tech Division as soon as I could. The Sci-Tech administrator at the time was Gabe Boker, who was very, very active and did wonderful stuff, including a sort of terminology exchange and a Stump the Translator feature every month. And I had responded to that a couple of times, and people had said, yeah, that sounds about right. So I walked into the conference, I navigated through all the corridors, and I ended up at the Sci-Tech Division meeting. And I walked in, and this tall guy with a Hungarian accent looked at me and looked at my nameplate and said, "Oh, you're Hartman." And that was Gabe. And that was my introduction to ATA.
Nice.
Here were all these wonderful people talking about cool stuff, figuring things out in various languages. And I thought, right, this is it. And I've never looked back. And so that was my first conference experience. And it is why anybody who asks me, well, it's kind of expensive to go to the conference. Should I go? And I said, absolutely. It will change your life. If it doesn't, then find a different line of work. But if this is for you, then the ATA conference is a central thing that you have to do.
That's preaching to the choir here. I've found myself saying the same thing as the longer I've been in the profession and the more years I attend the conference. Now, I did a little homework, and I have to say ATA headquarters helped me out on this. And I don't think you've missed a single conference since 1984. Is that right?
I believe so. Yeah, I have not. I'm about to, but so are we all. I will attend virtually. I would much rather have been in Boston, but no,
Yeah.
I've been to them all.
Yeah, I hear you. I'm registered for the virtual conference. I'm definitely going to be there, but real bummed not to be getting on a plane this year. And I can say that I've only missed three since 2000, and two of those were because I was an in-house translator and my company wouldn't send me, and the other one I was in grad school. So and I'm pretty sure I couldn't afford it. But in any case, you basically told me why you keep coming and what it's meant for you over the years. Tell us a little bit, maybe how the conference has changed over the years.
It's gotten much bigger, obviously. It has, what was appealing to me immediately at my first conference, as I said, was finding the Sci-Tech Division, which was definitely my tribe and has remained so. And there have been many, many more divisions established in order to allow other people to have exactly that same experience, which kind of atomizes and scatters things a little bit, but really not that much. There is still this sense of all of us doing pretty much the same thing and having much the same problems and issues and dissatisfactions as everyone else. So it's really just a matter of scale, but I think the scale is a good thing. The other interesting thing that's happened, and this is probably just me, as I've gotten older, more of my contemporaries have started to not show up for various reasons, and there are more and more new faces, and that is a great thing because if I ever started going to conferences and seeing only people I knew, I would start to worry.
Yeah,
So it
that's a
has,
good point.
the conference is a demonstration of how much ATA is growing and how it's attracting new people, and how people who used to be new people all of a sudden are doing stuff and sitting up there on the podium and that sort of thing. And that's very, very encouraging.
Yeah, I can only agree with that. Now, you are a technical and a scientific translator who specializes in patents, but you studied the classics and earned a PhD in classical archaeology. So I'd like to really know how you went from researching ancient texts and architecture to translating the latest innovations.
You mean, where do I get off thinking I'm a technical translator? I have to qualify my academic credentials. Yes, I have the degrees in those subjects. But in my defense, I spent most of my time in grad school in laboratories.
Okay.
Because I was interested in the material aspect of ancient cultures.
Okay, interesting.
How ancient peoples used different materials, metals, ceramics, stone tools, all sorts of things like that, which are susceptible to analysis by instruments, by scientific approaches. And that was the part of it I was always interested in. And that's what I did a lot of. I had various laboratory and research fellowships during my graduate career and wrote both of my theses on materials related subjects. So I was already prepped for an understanding of that kind of thing. And it's just that the time frame was a little different. Because the first work that I got as a freelancer back even way before I joined ATA was about metallurgy. And I already knew something about metallurgy. So I eased myself into it that way. It's not as much of a jump as it might seem.
What do you like about translating patents?
It's, you know what to expect. It's a fairly well-defined form in terms of the organization of the document. It has its own sub-language in every language. I mean, there's German patentees, there's English patentees, which you have to master as a sub-discipline. And there is the other aspect of it is that most of my colleagues don't want to have anything to do with it. So I've had not a lot less competition in the field because everybody says, "Oh, you do patents? Ew, I hate patents." Fine. So there's that. Occasionally you will find one where there's a real piece of ingenuity and innovation that somebody has come up with. And you get a sneak peek at that. And that's fun.
Cool.
And the relationships have been very interesting because the way that my career has developed is that I'm working principally with patent attorneys and with people in corporate patent departments. And you're talking directly to the people who are putting this stuff through the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. So you're a participant rather than just a service provider. And that's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, that makes a difference when you're basically have direct access to the authors and the people that are using the text. Now, you mentioned the Science and Technology Division a couple of times, and I've mentioned that you got active in the association right away, and I believe the Sci-Tech Division was one of the ways that you got active early on in the association. And I guess for our listeners, if anybody doesn't understand the concept of a division, these are sort of specialty or language specific groups within ATA that you can join to sort of find more like, it's like smaller niche groups within the large organization. I mean, ATA has almost nearly 10,000 members, and it's a way for you to find people that that have your interests or translate in your language pair. At the time when you joined the Sci-Tech Division, it was still in its infancy. In fact, the idea didn't really truly catch on until the 90s, I would say. In the early 90s, there were maybe just a few divisions. But now ATA has 22 divisions and spanning all kinds of languages and interests. And you've already shared why you joined the Sci-Tech Division. Maybe you can share a little bit more about how that benefited you and maybe what other divisions you've been involved with over the years.
Well, it was instantly my tribal home, as I explained when I first walked in, and I was welcomed with open arms by all of these people. And what it did for me was it allowed me to indulge my inner geek. It meant that it was really okay to collect old textbooks and trade journals and all this stuff, because that's what everybody else was doing, because you had to know this stuff and there was no other way to find it out. I also met an awful lot of really, really smart, interesting people with whom you can sit down and have a beer and talk about, carpet spinning fiber technology, and nobody thinks this is weird.
Yes.
So it was so nice to find this group of people. Just the most amazing people I have ever encountered have been through that avenue, that Sci-Tech Division avenue of ATA. I have also been, I think I still am, a member of other divisions, of language-specific divisions. German, of course, French and Italian, which are two other languages that I've worked in. And they've, especially in the early days, they were very useful. Sci-Tech was extremely useful in the early days because it offered these opportunities for terminology sharing. When you would be able, when we were beyond the paper age, but not yet into the Google age, and you are stumped, you put something up on the mailing list or the listserv, and somebody comes back and said, well, try this. And that still happens to some degree, but it's much reduced. But back in those days, that was a really, really important thing. And as I said, that was sort of that was my entrance exam, was being able to say something useful about terminology to my colleagues, even at an early stage. So that was really what it did for me. And I hope it's what it's doing for other people. And what all of the divisions do for other people is to provide a home and to allow for pretty intense exchange of information and of experience, mostly.
There are also places where a lot of members volunteer. And I'm sure a lot of those people you were having beers with and talking about very technical things were also ATA volunteers. And this is something that has played an essential role since ATA was founded. In fact, in the early years, I understand the association was run entirely by volunteers. And then, as you told us earlier, there was like one staff member at some point and one small tiny office and assistant. Today ATA has a headquarters outside of Washington, D.C. in Alexandria. It has a staff, not a huge staff, but it's definitely more than one person. And we certainly, I say we, the association certainly wouldn't be where we are today without ATA headquarters. We are the largest association of translators and interpreters in the world, with nearly 10,000 members in some 100 countries. But I think you'll agree with me that many of ATA's programs and initiatives just wouldn't be possible without members getting involved. And the divisions we just talked about are one example. In fact, they're entirely volunteer driven. New divisions are only established when members take the initiative. So back then, that Sci-Tech division, that was member driven. And today, ATA has literally hundreds of volunteers. And, you've been volunteering your time now for over 3 decades, and we're going to talk a little bit more about the various roles you've held within the association in a moment. But I guess I want to get a sense for why is that? Why do you think ATA works like that? Why do you think so many members give up their free time for the association?
Well, I can only speak for myself. I found all of these wonderful people. I found this structure that they had set up to allow me and lots of other people to interact and to learn and to make a living and to get better
Mm-hmm.
at what we were doing in order to make a living. And I felt very strongly that I had to give back. I had to
Mm-hmm.
do something in order to pass on what had been given to me,
Mm-hmm.
to try to become someone who might make some small contribution to inspiring other people to come up behind me.
Mm-hmm.
Because if all I did was squat on my laurels and be happy with what I'd gotten, then the association dies, then the
Mm-hmm.
profession dies. So I felt and feel very strongly that has to happen. And that's really what motivated me. I had certain things that I thought I could give, and I did my best to give them within my abilities, and that was what drove me.
Excellent. You mentioned your languages earlier, German, French, and Italian, and you are ATA certified in German to English, French to English, and Italian to English. When did you sit for the certification exams?
I think I haven't been able to find the certificates. I'm pretty sure it was in 1984 and 1985. It may even have been before the first conference. It was
Mm-hmm.
quite shortly after I joined because I found these exams as a part of the membership and thought, yeah, maybe that'll be useful.
Okay.
So I took them very early on.
Right on. What was the exam like back then?
Well, you show up at a particular room at the conference with
Mm-hmm.
your briefcase full of dictionaries and probably your number two pencil. I don't
Yeah.
remember.
Yeah.
But anyway, something to write on. I think they gave you a pad, and you sat at a desk, and somebody up front kept time and handed out the papers and told you when it was time to stop. And I believe it was two of three passages
Mm-hmm.
in the language combination. And you sat there and you wrote it out. And my handwriting is nothing special, so I had to be very careful not to make it any
Mm-hmm.
worse for the grader than it might have been. And that was it. And you time was up. You handed in your paper. You left, and then some time after that, you were told whether you had passed or not.
Yeah, it's quite different from today. I just took it in 2017, and I took it. I have a comparison because I took it very early in my career. I was quite naive and didn't understand really how difficult it was or how uh, poor my abilities were, I guess. And so I did take it when it was a written exam and sat in a room in Boulder, Colorado at the public library and had my suitcase full of dictionaries with me. And that suitcase didn't help because I'm pretty sure I failed miserably. When the computerized exam came out again, I took an interest in the exam again, and as I guess it felt like I would be able to take it more in my environment, how I was actually working, and it was true. That's the way I felt. There's a lot of details that are different than your normal working environment, but just being on a computer and having the ability to access the internet made a big difference for me. So there's a big difference now too that they can't just have just one proctor in the room. I think just sitting in the front of a room watching everybody, because with laptops and the internet, you have to kind of watch where people are getting their information, because there's some rules as to what kind of uh, resources you're allowed to use online. You can't go onto forums and ask questions, for example. And so there's proctors actually walking around the room and looking over your shoulder. That's a little unnerving. But other than that, I find that they've done a really good job to make the exam a little more like what your actual working conditions are like. So now, did taking the or having ATA certification back then have an impact on your business?
Well, I'm ashamed to say I don't think it did.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't. What again? One of the side effects of being involved with Sci-Tech was contact with a lot of people who had been doing this for quite a while. Many of them, as I said, were bureau owners who were excellent translators themselves, but who farmed out a certain amount of work to other people, and I
Mm-hmm.
began to get work from them.
Mm-hmm.
They really didn't care whether I had certification or not. What they cared about, they would send a page or two and say,
Mm-hmm.
"Here, try this." And I'd send it back and they'd say, oh, that's good. And they send you some more. So
Mhm.
the certification was less of an issue or less of a benefit then because the personal connection had already been made.
Yeah.
And I understand these days that that's far more difficult because the structures, especially of larger translation companies, are more corporate and things are more
Mhm.
detached. And you do need to have an objective criterion that people can judge you by without having to go through and look at your work. But
Mhm.
for me back then, it wasn't really that big a deal.
But the credential was fairly new at the time, right? So I imagine not a lot of people knew about it, and that's slowly changing. It's still not as widely known or well known outside the translation industry as we'd like it to be. But I think it's safe to say ATA certification within the translation industry is more well known than it was back then. Am I correct?
I think it is, but bear in mind also that the translation industry itself is much larger than it used to be.
Mm-hmm.
It was a very small um, business back then, a
Mm-hmm.
quite restricted number of people who were working and who probably all knew each other
Mm-hmm.
to some extent. So I think the two have gone hand in hand, and that's a good thing that as the industry itself has expanded, then the awareness of the credential has also expanded. And if it hadn't, we'd be in trouble. We'd need to do
Mm-hmm.
something about that.
Back to volunteerism. It didn't take long for you to volunteer at ATA's highest level. You were elected to the ATA board in 1988. You explained volunteering for you was a part of giving back. Was that pretty much the same reason why you wanted to serve on the board?
Very much so, yes. And I have to clarify that it's not that I volunteered, I kind of was volunteered.
Yeah. Well, you still have to say yes when they approach
I
you.
know. All right, yes. Um, and friend that I had made in ATA in the first few years, a guy named Steve Sachs, who was already on the board,
Mm-hmm.
said that he had read something that I'd put in the Sci-Tech newsletter or something that I'd written for the Chronicle, and he thought it sounded sensible. And he had put my name in nomination for the board.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, oh, that's very nice. And I was elected, and um, it got off to a slightly rocky start. I showed up to the wrong meeting
Okay.
at the conference. There were two meetings. There was the meeting of the old board and the new board, and I showed up to the old board meeting. It was shootout right
Okay.
from and came back to the correct meeting and sat down and tried to figure out the whole business about raising your hand and procedure
Mm-hmm.
and all that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And when it was over, the president, I think then was Deanna Hammond, and she said, "Well, I'll see you all for the winter meeting." And I said, "What? Wait, I thought the board only met at the conference." So I was already in for a little bit more of a commitment than I had realized, but by then it was too late.
Little
So
bit of a
again, it was,
surprise.
yeah,
Yeah.
it was a matter of saying, okay, I
Yeah.
think I can do this.
Mm-hmm.
I would really like to know how the association works. And this is pretty much where you're going to find out.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a fairly sensible person most of the time, and I think I can contribute to the general operating of things.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where and it just went from there.
Okay. Now, what were kind of some of the things that the board, you and the board members were working on or focused on at the time?
Well, we're talking about 1988
Mm-hmm.
to 1986. The last 2 years of that, I was secretary, I
Okay.
think. Yes. Or anyway, somewhere in there, I was secretary. And this was an interesting time in ATA's history because it was when we were trying to move out of the one room with Rosemary Malia
Mm-hmm.
phase into being a real professional organization. And that was time consuming and difficult, and it involved several of the founder members who were still on the board and very active
Mm-hmm.
having to be persuaded that maybe it was to hang them up. And there were some real personality issues that needed to be resolved. So it was essentially dragging ATA further into the 20th century, making it a more professionally run organization to go along with our pretensions to being an association of professionals. So there was a great deal of work on trying to find executive directors, looking at headquarters. We moved headquarters from upstate New York to the Washington area, to, I think it was originally Arlington and then to Alexandria. That's when that happened. And the most important thing that we did was in 1994 is we hired Walter Bakak.
Yeah.
We hired Mooch. And that changed everything, because we were finally putting our money where our mouth is. You know, we kept saying, well, hire a professional, don't use a grad student. Professional translators know what they're doing. And we had been trying to run the association as rank, in most cases, incompetent amateurs at administration. And we finally said, well, I think we better get somebody who knows what he's doing. And we did. And that really was the most important thing we did.
That's really fascinating. I did not know that. Now, you served on the board and from 1988 to 1996. And I think, yes, the last 2 years of that first stint, you were secretary. And then again from 2004 to 2011. But the last 4 years of that stint, I guess, you were ATA president-elect and then ATA president. What were the two experiences like, or how were they different from each other?
Well, again, I put my foot in my mouth the first time. The first meeting that I went to, we were in Toronto. And I decided I wanted to go back to the board. I wanted to, I had gratefully left in 1996, but I decided that I wanted to get involved again and see what I could do. So I walked into the meeting and I listened and tried to get a feel for what was going on. And toward the end of the meeting, something was being discussed. And I said, well, I would like to make a motion. And somebody said, wait, hold on. Here, fill out this form. So there was a board action request that had to be filled out, and that had to be put through the various procedures. So things had already, in the interim, gotten a great deal more professional. And I thought, okay, great, this is fine. And that really was what had happened, is that things were being run, a much tighter ship was being run at that point. And we were beginning to talk about a whole bunch of other stuff beyond the logistics of where headquarters was going to be and who was going to be doing the administrative work.
Now, I understand that ATA membership really started to go up in the, I would say, mid-90s, early mid-90s and after. And it seems to coincide with this whole idea of becoming a more professional organization, a more professional staff who's better at the administrative stuff. Is that correct? Is there a correlation there?
I don't know if there is. It wouldn't surprise me if there is. It wouldn't surprise me if I told you what it was that we were thinking about during my first experience on the board. And that was stuff we shouldn't have had to worry about. We shouldn't have had to worry about where the headquarters was and who was taking care of the filing. We should have been thinking about other stuff. Now we could. And we began to think about it. So the correlation is probably correct. I still maintain that hiring a professional executive director and allowing that executive director to take care of the other stuff freed up volunteer talent and mind space to think about stuff that only we can deal with.
That's perfect. Let's talk about some of those things, because in your second stint on the board, and especially your presidency, share with us some of the initiatives that were going on and some of the things that were accomplished during your presidency.
Well, I don't know that I can distinguish between initiatives and accomplishments, because sometimes the accomplishment lags considerably behind the initiatives. But yes, I made a short accounting of what it was that we at least tried to do, and some of them actually did happen. One of the things that was very important to me, especially when I got to be president-elect, which came with chairing the Governance and Communication Committee, which is sort of the internal operations committee of ATA, was
Mm-hmm.
what I called identity documents,
Mm-hmm.
our mission statement, our tagline, how we present ourselves, and by extension, how we think of ourselves.
Okay.
And I believe I came up with some good wording. We revised them, we worked on that. And I think we have a robust mission statement that is satisfactory to us and that conveys to the outside world who it is we are. We worked on divisions governance. This was a particular project of Dorothée Rousset, who was my successor as president and my colleague as president-elect.
Mm-hmm.
She worked very hard on getting the divisions to be partly self-governing and to thread the needle and walk the line between association control, because divisions are part of ATA, and division independence because they want to do their own thing. She also worked on an initiative that was very successful, which was the Business Practices Education Committee,
Mm-hmm.
which turned into an online listserv mailing list to allow people to ask questions and to learn about how you run a business as a translator. How do you approach translation as a way of making money, as a professional in terms of business? And she was very, very successful with that. We worked on certification, which is a constant thing that has been worked on for decades, and tried to figure out who takes it, how is it graded, what is it, what kind of qualification is it, all of those questions, none of which have been settled permanently and probably never will be. We worked on a project for a 50th anniversary printed history book about ATA, which I have in my bookshelf someplace, which involved lots of interviews, and that actually did happen. Public relations was a very important thing that we worked on in various ways, trying to figure out what's the best bang for the buck in terms of getting ATA in front of the public, and what public, and what do we want them to think about us, and how do we get that to happen. And one thing that I was particularly involved in, because I was in the top spots, and that's what you have to do, was external relations. I went to other people's conferences. I went to a BDU conference in Germany. I went to International Federation of Translators conferences. I went to one in Shanghai. In the conference in Denver in 2010, in the middle of my presidential term, the Association for Machine Translation in the Americas, the machine translation people, were co-located with just sort of another hotel down the street. We had a lot of interactions with them, and I had gone to one of their conferences a year or so.
Yeah, I remember that one. I remember that conference.
Canada, and they had demonstrated, as they said, that they were not, in fact, evil aliens, but they were actually really nice people with some very interesting ideas.
Yeah.
And that was a very important piece of interinstitutional outreach. And they're also really fun people. They're very interesting people. So that's what we did. That's what we tried to accomplish in that period when I was on the board.
Now, you mentioned PR, and I understand there was something that you were a bit of a champion of that you didn't mention, and that was more transparency when it comes to ATA governance. And I understand you wrote what's called How ATA Works, and it's sort of a comprehensive yet concise description of ATA's, many moving parts. We are a big ship, and it's sometimes hard to understand how the ship works. Why was that an important initiative for you?
I've always been interested in how things work. And during my second period on the board, it was not apparent to me in a lot of ways how various things worked, who was responsible for what. And I thought that if I didn't understand it, maybe there were other people who didn't understand it. And if I was on the board and I didn't understand it, that was really bad. So I came up with what was, in retrospect, a rather intricate flowchart of who does what. Again, mostly to enlighten myself. And it was partly for the for the use of the board so that people could understand what it is that's going on within the association.
Mm-hmm.
But I think we also distributed it in the Chronicle and to the members so that people could see what it was we were doing
Mm-hmm.
and essentially what we were spending their money on. And that was a very important initiative for me personally, to figure out how things work.
Now, earlier in our conversation, you told us a little bit more about what it was like to be, what it was like to be a translator in the 1980s. And what would you say is the biggest difference between being a translator then and today?
2 words: Google and Wikipedia. I mentioned reference resources.
Yeah.
In the 1980s, I began to build a reference library. I subscribed to trade journals.
Mm-hmm.
I sent in the little cards where you circle things and you get people to send you literature, and I had shelves full of literature. And I had secondhand textbooks, and I had dictionaries, and eventually I got an outside office
Mm-hmm.
with enough shelf space for all this stuff. And the way you judged a translator was how extensive his or her library was, and what wonderful obscure thing they have that you've never heard of. And that's like not the case anymore. I can't remember the last time I opened a book in order to find something out.
Yeah, that's amazing.
That is without question the change. It's not access to information is now utterly democratized. Anybody with an internet connection can find out pretty much anything.
Mm-hmm.
What that means is that what distinguishes the professionals from the amateurs is how you use that information, how you find it, how you know what to look for,
Mm-hmm.
and the use that you make of that. How good your judgment is as to what it is that whether what you find on the internet is something you really should be using.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's a fundamental shift in access to information and how you manipulate and use information, because we're in the information business, and that's fundamental.
You know, I heard that early members of the Sci-Tech Division collaborated via CompuServe. Is that correct? And would you say that translators, or many of the translators, have been ahead of the curve on technology?
Very well, certainly Sci-Tech was,
Mm.
because a lot of what Sci-Tech did was to actively promote the use of technology. I mean, modems. There were some really, really serious modem evangelists in Sci-Tech in the early days. And that was we saw that as part of our mission, to be a place not only for people who translate materials relating to science and technology, but to be what has become these days, I guess, the Translation and Computers Committee or Division, or Translation Language Technology Division.
Yes.
That was us in the beginning, was to promote the use of technology for translators, not just how you translate technical and scientific texts. So we were very, very much interested in figuring that out and promoting it. And yes, CompuServe was one of our main avenues of communication. It was called FLEFO, the Foreign Language Education Forum. And we basically hijacked the language teacher segment of that and took it over from some defenseless French teacher. And that FLEFO was wonderful. That was maybe 5 or 8 years when that was our means of communication. It was for terminology exchange. It was for all kinds of things. We had fantastic parties at conferences. And that was a real community that I miss, because, again, a lot of really smart people and a lot of tremendously generous people sharing what they knew, which was considerable. So yeah, CompuServe was definitely the good old days.
Can you just briefly tell most of us who've never experienced CompuServe how that worked? Was it like a chat room, or how did that exactly work?
I guess I've not done a chat room. You would log on with your modem and you would get to, it was not, it wasn't live. You
Mm-hmm.
would read the messages, you would reply to the
Ah,
messages,
okay.
and then you'd go back. It was all, I mean, it was incredibly primitive by present day standards. I mean, what
Mm.
we're doing now via talking via Zoom through our
Yeah.
computer screens would have been science fiction back then. It was all text based,
Mm-hmm.
and it was pretty slow, but it was there. You know, I would
Mm-hmm.
check into CompuServe maybe 3 or 4 times a day
Mm-hmm.
and download messages and take a look at them and figure out a way to go offline in order to read and reply so you're not chewing up expensive modem time.
Mm-hmm.
So that was, yeah, that was the experience.
Wow. I think it's safe to say you were then an early adopter in terms of technology. And have you tried to leverage new technological developments throughout your career? And
Um,
has that benefited you?
well, the first technological development I leveraged was a fax machine.
Mm-hmm.
I spent what was a really very, very large amount of money back then to get a fax machine because I realized that if I didn't have one, I wasn't going to be getting work.
Mm-hmm.
And if I did have one, I was going to be able to expand my client base, spend a lot less time at the post office, and a whole bunch of other things. So I took a deep breath and spent the money.
Mm-hmm.
And I had a fax machine until, God, I don't know, about 15 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And used it less and less and less. But that was the critical one that was my first early adoption of technology, specifically for my translation business. And from then, a whole bunch of other things followed. It became obvious that a computer and a modem were necessary
Mm-hmm.
for all kinds of other communication. It becomes necessary to do that when a customer contacts you and says, "Can you upload this to us?" And
Yeah.
you say, "What?"
What?
At that point, you figure, okay, yeah, I think I better be able to upload this stuff. So it's
Mm-hmm.
really demand driven.
Yeah. But you didn't shy away from it. I mean, when the opportunity presented itself, or you saw an opportunity like the fax machine, did you grab it?
Oh no, I knew I had to do it.
No.
At that point, I knew I had to do
Yeah. Well, I think, your career has shown, and you've experienced it firsthand, how our profession has changed, and it has always changed and evolved over the years. Go back to, you know, translators using a quill and papyrus or something to now. But I think the essence of what we do hasn't changed. We continue to, bridge the gap between languages and cultures. It's something we translators talk about. And ATA has also changed. We've just had the conversation, and you've shown us how ATA has changed and evolved over the years, how different it is from the early years. But the mission, which you also worked to focus, has essentially not changed. It's always been about advancing the translation and interpreting professions and fostering professional development. I think even back in the days when, that you were describing early on, that it was about working together, finding translators, advancing the professions. And you really have experienced so much of that change over the last 3.5 decades. As a final question, Nick, what do you think, after all this experience, what do you think the future holds for our professions?
it. I wish I knew. I think it's going to have to have something to do with specialization. And
Mm-hmm.
I have always been a great proponent of specialization because what I realized early on with interacting with my colleagues, especially in the Sci-Tech arena, is that the more specialized you become, the fewer competitors you have.
Mm-hmm.
And the fewer competitors you have, the more collegial you can be.
Mm-hmm.
If you're a plumber, you have to either be the world's greatest plumber, or you have to compete on price, or you have to do something and make yourself distinctive. If you are a translator who specializes in, say, German electrical patents, or if you are somebody who does waste management out of Portuguese or whatever it is, you're not going to have a lot of other people trying to muscle into that. And you can then be very generous with everything that you know, because you know that you're the best and you're going to stay that way. The problem right now is that automatic translation, machine translation, is definitely around. And I've tried running, say, a not that terrible paragraph of a German patent through Google Translate. And it was appalling, unusable. It is almost incomprehensible, and it is certainly nothing that can be sent to the US Patent Office. So Google Translate is not very good, but it's good enough for a lot of things. If I want to find out, I've always been interested in photography. If I wanted to find out more about a Korean camera or something, in the old days, I would have had to order the brochure, find somebody that knew Korean. Can you do me a favor? Tell me what's in this. No, I run it through Google Translate. And the translation is laughable, but it tells me what I want to know. So that document is gone. You can't compete. That's what you're doing. So you have to go to the niche markets, the higher markets, where only a human being can do what needs to be done, where you can't allow a machine to do it because the machine is not going to be good enough. We have to identify those areas where we are still better than the machines, and where I suspect we're always going to be better than the machines. Because if we try and compete with the machines, which means competing with the software developers, we're going to lose. And we're just going to be resentful, and it's not going to benefit anybody, least of all us. So I think the future lies in specialization. And I am happy to be, I have to say it, toward the end of my career rather than the beginning, because it's going to be very difficult for people beginning in the profession to get over the initial hump of developing a specialty and finding expertise and finding customers, and getting to the point where you can in fact say, no, you don't want to put that through Google Translate, you want to send that to me. So it's a difficult time. And if I could predict the future, I'd be getting rich on the stock market, but unfortunately that's not the case.
Well, I think the specialization message is a great one, and it's one that ATA also advocates. And I've heard numerous experienced veterans echo what you just said, Nick, and I think it's a great way for us to wrap up today's podcast. So let me thank you so much for joining me today and taking some time to celebrate International Translation Day and the ATA Podcast 50th show. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Matt. It was a pleasure. Nice to talk to you.
You've been listening to past ATA President Nick Hartman. Episode 50 was written and produced by me. Mixing and editing was done by Derek Platts. Ben Carl is our announcer. And the music you heard today was produced by Ben Sound. Big thanks to Nick as well as Mary David for providing insights into ATA's history that helped this show come together. And thanks as always to Rashawn Paccarel at ATA headquarters. You can subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Google, TuneIn, Stitcher, or Spotify. You'll also find all previous episodes of the pod on ATA's website, atanet.org, under Resources. And if you like what you heard today, or have any comments about today's podcast or past shows, or any thoughts or ideas for new shows, please don't hesitate to write. You can reach me at podcast@atanet.org. ATA is on social, of course, so be sure to follow us there and keep up with all the latest. Oh, and one last thing. Please take a moment to rate the pod or leave a review if possible. And be sure to tell a colleague or a friend about us. Thanks again for listening, everyone. Talk to you again soon.